welcome to episode 16 of What Sex Got to Do with It. And I'm here with my favorite 84-year-old great grandmother. But first, I have to tell you something. You know, he, 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 I've gotten some information, from our local cluster of galaxies that include Andromeda, that there is another author, great grandmother.
Oh
Yeah,
dear.
yeah. And initially we thought that she was older than 84-year-old, 84. But the revolution of that planet around the sun, didn't, it made it seem that she was older. But when you control me for our sun, actually she's younger. So
Oh,
it
phew.
still holds.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah.
So, so this chapter is called "It's a Bountiful World." And
And actually, this chapter came from a colleague, one of my Georgia's colleagues,
uh,
who was visiting from the West, and we had lunch together at Jimmy's. And, I expressed my despair over the climate. And when Gibb and his wife were walking me back to my condo just across the street, he said, Heather, don't despair. You have to remember it's a bountiful world.
oh,
It's a bountiful world. In fact, I credit him in the
okay.
acknowledgments for reminding me that it's a bountiful world. He said, there's plenty for all of us, all species, humans. There's plenty for everyone. We just have to correct the flaws in the distributive function of human economic systems. So he just said, remember, it's a bountiful world.
Right.
And I thought the last chapter, we were a little wonky talking about that. I have to save myself sometimes from despair because I can worry about the climate and inequality and injustice by taking a walk in the woods. And I'm just always reminded that it's a bountiful world. And my own life is a bountiful life. I feel not often, but I recently told someone, if you put something on my tombstone, just put love's been good to me. Because I've been lucky in having such warm relationships with so many people. And I'm very, very lucky. I feel the natural world return the love that I feel for it. So that is what the Bountiful World title comes from, but it's directly in response to Gibbs saying, Heather, don't get down. Remember, it's a bountiful world.
I'm glad, and I don't recall you mentioning him when we, did the acknowledgments, because we did the acknowledgments first,
Yeah.
and that's why we're on chapter 15 now, even though this is episode number 16. So when you talk about this, you open it up and you talk about the nature of the species. That it's a wonderful species that can create places like New York City, which I love, but more so like all the variety that's there. But yet has all these inequities. And I'm kind of curious. Do you think that it's kind of the natural process that those two would kind of go hand in hand? That it would take a certain degree of inequality, because and I'm getting at inequality as opposed to inequity, because I think that we aren't necessarily going for there being poverty. Let me rephrase that. Of course, we're not going for poverty. I think we're not going for that everyone has to have the same amount.
No.
We just want to make sure that everyone has enough to thrive. So do you think that it requires a society in which you do have a certain level of inequality, but still equity, or still people to produce a place like New York?
Well, I don't. Henry George's book, again,
Yeah.
Progress and Poverty, he puzzled over how come the more material progress we make, and he quoted the big cities, the poverty in those cities is more extreme. As we create more wealth, the inequality becomes more extreme. I don't think we need the kind of inequality that makes it difficult for some people to live. I think we're a hierarchical species. As one of the wonderful things that I love about us as a species and the individuals within a species, we all have different talents and abilities, different motivations. Some people aspire to own more things, to have more things, to work harder. Other people want leisure time to dream, to think, to paint, to write. So we're driven, we're different. We bring different skill sets. So I don't think that you need to have inequality in order to have achievement. Achievement happens. We're so good at sharing skills. That's the upside of our language ability. I think I mentioned somewhere in the book, not in this chapter, but any other species, if you took the skills of each individual and combined it into one super animal, it wouldn't be much different than the individuals. Humans, not so. You combine all our skills essentially in, if you look at the entire species, all the individuals, the super species that look at what we can do. I marvel, I wouldn't know how to manufacture a lead pencil. And yet people are building or working on nuclear fusion. I read about that and I think, wow, the things that our combined talents can produce. But I don't think that it's necessary to have inequality in order to have achievement, because people are driven by different things. Some people want to write symphonies, some people want to build skyscrapers. And that's the thing I too often say, oh, we're not a pretty species. But in that sense, in the extent of all the wonderful things we can produce, we are a pretty species. But what's not pretty about us is when, when greed. When greed and tribalism are two really human species-specific traits that we have to learn to rise above. And I think we are. I think individuals do it all the time. But I think, if we really want to have a sustainable and a just world, we have to really watch that we're not just indulging greed. When we were talking, again, I was in a science discussion about creating nuclear fusion, which that's not my field at all. I think, wow, amazing that people know how to do this, and some of the people in the group actually have worked in the field. But at one point they say, well, it's great because we have a combination of public and private investment in building a sun. Of course, my reaction is, hello, there is already a sun up there. Isn't it a bit hubris to think that we need to build one here just so humans have this endless supply of energy so we can have all this excess of stuff? That doesn't make sense to me. But one of them was talking about, well, this is good, the fusion of public and private investment in the creation of a nuclear fusion as an energy source. And then they named some of the big investors, some of the big tech guys, and I said, ooh, I don't want those guys being in charge of my future because they're very profit driven. They are, they're also driven to discover and develop, but the profit motive is pretty strong there. And so whenever the development, a driving force behind the development is to earn a big profit, I become uneasy.
But I guess one of the good things about fusion, though, is it would stop. Decrease our need to use fossil fuels.
And people keep saying when it's going to happen. Yeah. And the reply has been pretty standard for decades. Oh, maybe in the next 30 years. That's the same time frame that they quote. Right. So I rather than trying to create another sun, I think it would be better to educate people to control some of their consumption. That's that. I think that's a more reasonable way to get there in less than 30 years.
Right. So in talking, there's a sentence early on in this chapter where you say that an economy that grants personhood to corporations but denies it to the more than human beings, this is a Wendigo economy. Mm-hmm. So I have two questions. So what do you mean by a more than human being?
I don't remember when I wrote that and at what point that fit. Read it again to me.
Sure, and you're talking about Marshall Solins, and that the market system artificially creates scarcity by blocking the flow between the source and the consumer. Mm-hmm. And then you end by saying an economy that grants personhood to corporations but denies it to the more than human beings.
Okay, and again, I'm thinking of Citizens United, where we're saying that corporations are people,
Okay.
and yet those who are deprived,
All right.
the very things they need to
Right.
live.
Right.
How can we say that corporations are humans, and yet we consider some people almost less than human?
Got you. So that's
So,
you mean.
so that
Got you.
that is my meaning
Yeah.
on that
Okay.
one.
I
And
kind
I'm
of.
quoting,
Yeah.
Robin Wall Kimmerer, the who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, and anyone who has not read that book should really read that book.
Right.
I've been very moved by her writing,
Yeah.
and her sense that a sharing economy
Right.
and sort of the kinds of reciprocity where when one of us thrives, we all thrive.
Right.
That's it. And also living in balance with the natural world. She's
Right.
very, very, very instructive. She's, I think her PhD is in, trained botanist. She's, I think her PhD is in botany, but she's also a member of one of the native indigenous groups.
Right.
And so she brings the two ways of knowing,
Right.
both that kind of indigenous hunter-gatherer, respect the environment way of knowing with a deep understanding of the science of plants and nature.
Right.
And so Braiding Sweetgrass is just a really lovely book. It's a series
Braiding
of Braiding Sweetgrass.
Yeah.
And it's funny, it was published by a small publisher,
Yeah.
maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Didn't get much of a fuss, just by word of mouth.
Right.
It's now consistently on the bestseller list. Just by word of mouth. So I think people are hungry for that kind of knowledge, the sense that it is a bountiful world, and we just have to treat it with respect, and there will be plenty for everyone. There's enough bounty for all.
Right. So can you explain the Wendigo economy?
That's her expression,
Right.
and that's like a mythical figure that just consumes greedily everything.
Yeah.
Just ravishes the world, and it's so in her culture that's a mythical figure, and I look at what we're doing right now and I think she may even say it's a Wendigo economy. I think that where we just consuming without returning,
Right.
and just ravaging the natural world without giving back to it, just like in some of her essays, she talks about you thank the plant that you're harvesting twigs from. You express gratitude. You take care of it. You recognize you don't cut everything down. You know you need it in the future. And that way of viewing the world, I find, as I say, other people must too, because it's now consistently high on the bestseller list. I think it was published as a paperback, so it's on the paperback bestseller list, but
Right.
it consistently is, and it makes me happy every time I see it there.
Right. So in this chapter you talk about the crow.
Joe the Crow.
Joe, and you talk about this photo that exists that I guess your granddaughter had, or
My
your
daughter,
had.
that's pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
I was always hopping on the 77 bus and going to a lecture somewhere, Harvard, Radcliffe, MIT. And this was at the Radcliffe Institute. Someone was talking about New Caledonian crows and their tool use. And my daughter Ingrid said, "I'll go with you, Mom." And so the two of us went, and we got in there. Here she pulled out a photograph that she'd had, a 70-year-old photograph of me. I guess it was the first day Joe the Crow entered our lives. And the story of Joe the Crow, my parents never had much money, but they always liked nice real estate. So they always rented properties that they never could afford to buy. They rented a sort of run-down but once elegant 10-acre property in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And my father was out one morning. He just despaired of his 3 daughters who were all late sleepers. And he would get up at dawn, and he was out, wedged himself into a wild bramble of blackberry bushes, and was picking blackberries into his hand and then eating them. And while he was doing that, suddenly a crow just dropped from the sky and landed on his forearm and started eating the blackberries that were in his palm. So Daddy walked back to the house, bouncing that crow the crow just balanced there like it was a falcon on his arm. And he woke us up to come down. The crow had obviously been hand raised by someone, we never knew who. But we played with him. we had a stone patio in the back of the house, and my two sisters and I would bring things out to entertain him. We were blown away by his skill, his intelligence, his tool use. I say he invented either a musical instrument or a toy, whatever. And he was a thief. He was a scoundrel, and he once my father had brought him home, and the three of us had played with him. We much debated, are we going to keep him? Oh, because we wanted him. He was so magical. He was just so lovely. A bunch of old cages in the barn we could have put him into. But he seemed like he was making a gift of himself to us, and that wouldn't be right to keep him. In addition, the whole time he was with us, the wild crows are circling above, cawing and warning and telling him, danger, danger, and we didn't want to prove them right either. So he would play with us for half an hour. Took my father's lens cap from his camera, flew up, hit it in a knothole in the walnut tree in the yard. Oh, anything shiny, up it went. He would take it. But he could give him a little hard rubber ball. He could bounce it across the patio. My sister Gail brought out one of those old-fashioned pencil sharpeners, like used to be fastened to the teacher's desk. She put it on the patio, showed Joe how it worked. With his beak, he put a pencil in it, stood on one leg, and with the other leg tried to turn the handle. Was never able to actually sharpen the pencil. He didn't have that kind of strength. So we gave him stuff with moving parts that entertained him. And I mention in the book, in hindsight, with my fascination with the evolution of language, I look back on what I think was the most amazing thing that Joe ever did, because when I was in undergraduate school, I had a psychology professor tell me that you can't hold something in mind unless you have language to name it. So I'd kind of always believed that. So we gave Joe an empty good and plenty box, the old-fashioned, with the flaps at either end. There was a driveway in front of our house that had gravel in it. When he's on the patio, he can't see that gravel, yet somehow he held in mind that gravel was out there. That, in hindsight, amazes me. He picked that empty good and plenty box up, flew low to the ground around the house. Obviously, he wanted the three of us to follow him. When he got to the driveway, he closed one flap, picked up, put a half dozen pebbles or so into the good and plenty box, closed the lid on it, picked it up, and shook it like a rattle or a music. He was just amazing. So for several weeks, every morning he would come. The porch roof was right outside my bedroom window. And at daybreak, oh, my father loved that crow. He got us all up at daybreak. He would come at daybreak, land on the porch roof, and peck, peck, peck on my bedroom window. How he even knew that was where to peck, I have no idea. But we'd get up and run outside and play with him. And then,
yes, read the book. Because we're going to end up in tears when we talk about that.
Yeah,
so,
I will. I'll
yeah.
cry right now. Yes,
yeah,
it's true.
So no, definitely read the book. But it gets a little rough. But then there's we pulled through the rough part. But you see, there's a picture.
Yes.
Your daughter has a picture. Is that picture still available?
Oh yeah.
So I'm not going to promise anything, but just maybe we'll be able to edit it in if you can get it to ACM. If not, if it's not possible.
I have it. I actually have a copy of it.
Yeah.
I'm crouched behind him like this,
Yeah.
just like I cannot believe the miracle of that crow.
Yeah, because the picture's not in the book.
No.
So then, if the picture's in this series, it'll be like
And my older sister Sandy, who was 3 years older, she's watching a little more relaxed about the whole thing. I was just overcome with the miracle of that crow. That crow, with that crow.
Well, even you, as your daughter, I think, said, or maybe your granddaughter says, you're the girl that
cries
wow.
I'm the girl that cries wow. Yep.
So even since then, I'm going to right now. I'm gonna do a little kind of housekeeping, before we come back to the last chapter to discuss, Alaska's system and politics and money. But 2 episodes ago, I mentioned Jennifer Lerner, in the context of decision making and the angry mind. So I just wanted to say to folks that the name of the paper is Portrait of an Angry Decision Maker. But we were talking about how strong emotions, especially anger, can lead people to feel a sense of certainty, especially about being the victim, and that sense of certainty kind of stops the thinking process. I'm not saying necessarily a conclusion is wrong, but that you stop thinking. It probably inhibits the ability to come to better conclusions, even if your conclusion's right. And the other thing I had mentioned was from an earlier chapter where you talked about generosity and a loose collection of traits that you say, to quote you, says that I code as control of social resources rank high on the list of characteristics that add luster to a man's sexual aura. Yep. What's that loose constellation of traits?
Well, I've talked so much about control of material resources because that's where the environmental damage comes from. But there were other traits that made a man equally attractive, if not even more so. And things like generosity, good with my kids, admired by his friends. So that's control of social resources. And I think in mentioning those, where I was going with that was that much as I've talked about this kind of greed, more, there's also, we have these other kind, generous, giving, wonderful traits that women have selected men for and that are in us. They're part of our species. And those are the traits we have to draw on if we're going to solve some of our problems. But control of social resources gives a man great aura. You'd talk to me a few sessions ago about, I think, positive and negative leadership.
Power.
Power. And that's a positive power, like the control of social resources, where you've got friends that will do anything for you and that you'll do anything for, and that he's a positive leader. He's a leader by virtue of people want to follow him, and so those are the traits. We have those really wonderful traits, and they're part of our species specific arsenal, and we're going to need those to solve some of the problems brought about by our greed and by our tribalism. Tribalism we have to rise above too.
Right. So we ended the last episode in talking about money and politics, and we said we'd pick it up here. So I want to go back to it a little bit. And so a question I have is, do you think it's possible for a politician to accept a lot of money and not be corrupted?
I guess it's.
And I don't mean like a low frequency. I mean, it's like, do you think that it? Because a lot of politicians accept money.
Yeah.
So are you saying that they're all on some level? The word isn't corrupt. I think overly influenced by.
Overly influenced.
Do you think that's the case?
It's hard not to, because of the reciprocity we're talking about. If someone gives you a gift, that's an imbalance of reciprocity. So you want to do something back. You and I were talking about that earlier. And so a donation of a large amount of money, there's now an imbalance in reciprocity. And so there is sort of a need to want to do something for that person. And so I think because reciprocity is important to us, I think that does make it very, very difficult to ignore the influence of a large donation of money. I mean, I don't think most people would acknowledge that they've been influenced, but they'll think, well, he really has a good idea on that. I should pay attention to that idea. That's how our brain is so tricky,
Well, it would also mean, so I hear you there, and I think one of the things that could work too to help people not focus so much on their next election, which is often, I think, the influence of the money, because generally you need the money for your campaign, and then for your next one, is if we gave people electeds easy off ramp, so that so that because we at a certain level they're earning a salary, so
Mhm.
their position is their livelihood. And so it's kind of hard to give up your source of
Mhm.
income. Clearly, people become attached to it because it becomes part of the identity, but also it's like their livelihood. So that if we just said, well, you know what, in your first year out, you get like a certain percentage of your salary. Enough to
Mhm.
certainly live on. Because I'll tell you, here in Arlington, the select board gets just a stipend of
Yeah.
250
Yeah.
a month. And on some levels, you would think, well, it's nice. It'd be nice to make more. But the fact that your income isn't coming from that means that it's really easy to say, you know what, I'm just going to make the best decision that I can,
Mhm. Mhm.
because if I don't get elected, again, it's not like I'm losing my income,
Yeah. Right. Right.
and so as hard as it may be to essentially have two jobs, it does make it easier
Mhm.
to make decisions. If for me, it wouldn't be, so now it's like a person could give me as much as they wanted for the campaign, but I'm not feeling that tug. In fact, if anything, I find that I have to be careful about not overcompensating
Mhm.
for it, and that does a disservice too,
Mhm.
to the person and the cause behind them. So I'm totally on board with getting the money out of politics. But
Yeah.
then, as I said, making it easy for the person, to
And
exit.
and
You
I'm
know,
actually in favor. I mean, our federal politicians, they retire quite nicely, I
yeah,
believe, after
yeah,
they've spent so many years in
yeah,
office. And I'm in favor of paying them a wage commensurate with what they would earn in the private sector,
right,
so that there is not this temptation to accumulate money and power. And I'm really putting those two together
right,
because very often they are together, just
right.
like youth and beauty are often together.
Um, in the eyes of the beholder.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
definitely true.
yeah, yeah.
Definitely true. But
Because
mm,
I think some people are attracted to older people.
I
Uh,
think some of that may be influenced by the person's gender, but I could be wrong on
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, men tend to be attracted. Again,
Yeah,
that biology is not destiny; it's statistical probability. But in general, men tend to be attracted to younger women, and very often women are attracted to older men. Not so much because they like them old, but they've accumulated more wealth at that point.
yeah,
But
yeah.
that's again, that's a stereotype that you can't assume that that's true for everybody because it's
Yeah.
definitely not.
But right. But we're talking the
Pro-
averages.
yeah, the
Which is what,
probability.
yeah,
Yeah,
which is all the base of
yeah,
population and evolution.
yeah.
So with that, we end, and then we get ready for our final episode.
Excellent.
So thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.